Certainly the old argument that McGee somehow, quote, kept Irish Catholics in Canada loyal, unquote, has no foundation, as Peter Toner pointed out in 1974. Although the breadth of Irish-Canadian Catholic opposition to McGee has been exaggerated, in my view. Another approach would be to examine the activities of the Canadian Secret Police Force. Established in 1864 to counter the threat of Confederate raids into the United States, and transformed the following year to counter the threat of Fenian raids into Canada. This is a fascinating story, as Irish and Canadian-born detectives fanned out into cities, towns, and villages on both sides of the border, while the government intercepted and opened mail heading for Fenian focal points in northern New York and Vermont, and a host of shady characters and disgruntled Fenians sought new employment opportunities as paid informers. It's a story that has yet to be fully told, although Greg Keeley has made an early foray into the field, and there's been a recent and, I regret to say, sensationalist, misleading, and deeply disappointing biography of one of the key informers in the Fenian movement, Thomas Billis Beach, also known as Henri Le Caron. But it's not the story of the Canadian Secret Police I'll be telling you now, although I do know it. Instead, I'd like to focus on the central figure in the Canadian fight against Fenianism, the Attorney General, Minister of Justice, Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald. I'd like to examine his approach to the suspension of habeas corpus in the immediate aftermath of Ridgeway, the Fenian incursion or invasion or raid, June 1st, 1866. Coming a few days after the Fenian invasion had been turned back, the suspension of habeas corpus was publicly justified in terms of countering the external threat of Fenianism. The same applied to its renewal and extension during the new Dominion of Canada in November of 1867. In arguing for renewal, Macdonald referred to the international activities of the Fenian Brotherhood and to recent intelligence reports that American Fenians were stockpiling arms at the frontier and preparing for another invasion. He also pointed out that the existing suspension had, as he said, not been harshly or improperly used, which was true enough. Among other things, Macdonald had issued a circular to magistrates in 1866, warning them against hasty and ill-judged arrests of suspected Fenians. All this meant that the bill for suspension of habeas corpus, for the renewal of suspension, generated hardly any controversy. There were no public protests, no outraged editorials, although the one place where one might have expected strong opposition, the pro-Fenian Irish-Canadian newspaper, is not extant for 1867. Nor was there a sense of panic or a rising wave of popular anti-Fenianism. In fact, there was barely a whisper. The suspension of habeas corpus was treated as part of the humdrum business of Parliament. The Globe mentioned it briefly in a column entitled "Nothing to Do," the main theme of which was that Parliament had no serious or important matters to discuss. And even this was more than appeared in other leading Canadian newspapers, which made no editorial comment at all. True, Timothy Warren Anglin and Antoine-Aimé Dorion expressed scepticism, but they acquiesced when they were told that the country faced an imminent threat of invasion. In the event, the vote for renewed suspension was unanimous. And yet, when Macdonald framed the renewal in terms of the external threat, he was only telling half the story. His intelligence sources also revealed increased Fenian activity within Canada, forming new circles, raising money, attempting to draw non-commissioned officers into the organization, planning diversionary actions to pin down troops during the next invasion. Not a word of this appeared in any of his public speeches about the suspension of habeas corpus. Not a word. It's always difficult to draw inferences from silence, but it seems reasonable to assume that two factors were operating. First, MacDonald knew that any public statement about the revolutionary intentions of some Canadian Fenians could easily have produced an anti-Catholic backlash, with heightened Protestant suspicions that Irish Canadian Catholics were untrustworthy, devious, and disloyal. Such a backlash would have intensified ethno-religious divisions within the country and produced an atmosphere in which Fenianism could flourish, the very last thing that he wanted. So I think that's one factor. And second, MacDonald had worked long and hard to cultivate the Irish Catholic vote and did not want to jeopardize that support with general pronouncements about a Canadian Fenian conspiracy. So on the grounds of both prudence and political advantage, it made sense for him to focus on external invasion and say nothing about internal subversion. And here lies the irony, because legislation that was justified in terms of external circumstances and government trustworthiness would actually be applied solely against real or suspected internal Fenians, with charges that the Conservatives were using the suspension of habeas corpus as a political weapon to discredit their Irish Catholic liberal enemies and to bolster their own position. And what brought this about? 3 minutes? What brought this about was Magee's assassination in April of 1868. Convinced that Magee was the victim of a Canadian-based Fenian conspiracy, in the context of more reports about American Fenian reconnaissance missions in Canada, MacDonald and the Irish Catholic Crown Counsel, James O'Reilly, detained some 25 Irish Canadians under the suspension of habeas corpus. Now, not surprisingly, the first to be arrested were friends and associates of Patrick James Whelan. But the net soon widened to bring in leading Fenians in Montreal, in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Guelph. The idea was not only to crack open the perceived conspiracy centred on Whelan, but to use the assassination to disrupt and defeat the revolutionary underground in Canada, something that could now be done, MacDonald and O'Reilly believed, without alienating moderate Irish Catholic opinion. The arrests were highly selective. They were based on accumulated intelligence information, which for the most part seems to have been accurate. But some mistakes were made, and as Frank Iacobucci wrote in his report, mistakes are inevitable. And the longer the prisoners were held in jail without trial, the greater became the risk of alienating Irish Catholics in general. Unless just cause was shown for the arrests, George Brown predicted in early May, we shall have plenty of Irishmen persuading themselves that they are as much ill-used here as ever they were in Ireland. And indeed, something along these lines began to occur amid complaints that the government was using Fenian fear tactics to conduct a campaign of political persecution against its Irish Catholic opponents. Hardline nationalists fulminated against the government's reign of terror, phrase was used, that word again, and spoke of avenging injustice through supporting invasion. Moderates became increasingly uneasy. The release during the summer of all but the core Fenian leaders went some way to reassuring the moderates while making no discernible difference to the militants. Politically, the Fenians in Canada had been isolated and marginalized. In this sense, Magee's death enabled MacDonald to implement Magee's strategy. But, contrary to the government's belief, they had not been broken, and if anything, were potentially more dangerous to the state than before. It was only when the external threat was defeated that the internal threat dissipated. Whether there are lessons here for our own time remains to be seen. Thank you very much.